The crystal wine glass clinked softly against the dinner plate, but the sound that followed was deafening. It wasn't the laughter from the head of the table that made my hands freeze. It was the absolute silence that fell over the room right after my new son-in-law, Brandon, leaned back in his chair, adjusted his designer tie, and smiled at his friends. "Let's be honest," Brandon said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded dining room. "Arthur worked 40 years in high school administration just to hand us a pension that barely covers our weekend trips to Aspen. It's cute, really, absolute pocket change." My daughter Clara didn't stop him. She didn't look at me. She simply took a slow sip of her champagne and let the room chuckle. They thought I was an old man who couldn't hear well. They thought 40 years of quiet service meant 40 years of complete foolishness. I didn't slam my fork down. I didn't raise my voice, nor did I demand an apology. Instead, I took a slow sip of my water, looked Brandon straight in the eye, and smiled softly. In my right jacket pocket sat my fountain pen. In my left sat the original draft of my estate plan, a document that controlled 300 acres of prime lakeside property and a private trust fund they knew nothing about. By the time the wedding reception ended that night, every single line of that document had been rewritten, and Brandon was about to learn the difference between being quiet and being broke. To understand why that moment cut so deep, you have to understand where I came from. I served 38 long years as a high school vice principal in a modest town outside of Chicago. It was hard, relentless work. Early mornings, unlocking the school gates in freezing winter dawn, long afternoons mediating student conflicts, and endless budget meetings that stretched late into the night. But I loved my work, and above all else, I loved my family. When my beloved wife, Eleanor, passed away 12 years ago after a long battle with illness, my entire world narrowed down to one single focus: raising our daughter, Clara. I swore to Eleanor on her final day that I would protect Clara from every hardship life could throw her way. When Clara wanted to attend a prestigious out-of-state university, I paid every single dime of her tuition out of pocket. I worked extra summer school sessions, took weekend bus driving shifts, and managed athletic events late into the evenings so she would graduate without a single cent of student debt. When she moved into her first luxury apartment in the city, I wrote the check for the security deposit and paid her first 6 months of rent in advance. I lived simply. I drove a 10-year-old sedan that was completely paid off, wore tailored but modest wool suits, and kept my home neat and unpretentious. Because I never bragged about money, people made lazy assumptions about me. They saw an old man who clipped grocery coupons and assumed I had nothing else to my name. What my daughter and her new husband failed to realize was that my parents had left me a vast parcel of timberland decades ago. Over 40 years, while working my humble school job, I quietly invested in local real estate, secured high-yield government bonds, and managed the land with extreme care and patience. I wasn't just living on a school pension. My pension was simply what I used for daily groceries, morning coffee, and utilities. My actual estate was worth millions of dollars. I had planned to give almost all of it to Clara and her new family on her wedding day. I had a thick leather folder ready in my study, containing the title deeds to a spacious 4-bedroom lake house and a structured trust that would guarantee her financial independence for the rest of her life. Then came Brandon. Brandon was 32, worked in corporate software sales, and wore his ambition like a bright neon sign. From the very first day Clara brought him home for Sunday dinner, he treated my modest house like a stepping stone. He made subtle, biting jabs about my old furniture, mocked my choice of car, and patronized my quiet lifestyle in front of our neighbors. I let it slide for 2 whole years. I chose peace over conflict because I believed he made Clara happy. I believed in grace. I believed that young men sometimes talk big to hide their own deep insecurities. But there is a very fine line between youth insecurity and arrogant disrespect. The wedding was held at an upscale country club overlooking the rolling hills. I paid for the entire event out of my own pocket, writing a check for $55,000 without a single second of hesitation, because I wanted my only daughter to have the dream wedding her mother always wished for her. During the reception dinner, I sat at the head family table, surrounded by Brandon's wealthy parents, his corporate colleagues, and his high society friends. Throughout the evening, Brandon made continuous, passive-aggressive remarks aimed at my expense. When my younger brother, Uncle Thomas, asked Brandon about their upcoming honeymoon plans in Europe, Brandon laughed loudly enough for 3 tables to hear. "Oh, we're flying first class to Greece," Brandon announced, swirling his wine glass. Clara's dad offered to contribute a little something, but you know how high school pensions are. We decided to pay for the upgrades ourselves so we wouldn't end up staying at a 2-star budget motel. A few people at the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My brother Thomas looked at me, his jaw clenched tight with anger. I placed a gentle, steady hand on Thomas's arm, silently signaling him to hold his peace. I was not going to ruin my daughter's wedding night over a young man's loud mouth. An hour later came the formal speeches. Brandon stood up at the microphone, champagne glass in hand. He thanked his parents, praised his college fraternity friends, and spoke endlessly about his upcoming business venture. Then he turned his eyes toward my table. "And to Arthur," Brandon said, his tone dripping with patronizing warmth. "Thank you for raising Clara. You're a simple man of modest means. And while your pension might only be pocket change to guys in my industry, we appreciate the sentiment and the cheap wine." The room let out a faint, awkward wave of laughter. I looked over at Clara. She didn't frown. She didn't defend the man who had paid every bill of her life. She simply smiled weakly, looking down at her napkin as if my dignity was a small price to pay for her husband's popularity. That was the exact second the scale tipped. It wasn't just that Brandon had insulted my 38 years of hard labor. It was that he reduced 40 years of sacrifice, discipline, and quiet love into a cheap joke, and my own daughter allowed him to do it. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice or throw my glass. I stood up calmly, walked across the floor to Brandon, patted him gently on the shoulder, and whispered, "May you always get exactly what you deserve, Brandon." He grinned broadly, assuming I was giving him my traditional blessing. He had no idea I had just delivered a solemn promise. At 10 o'clock that evening, while the music was still blasting downstairs, I slipped out to the parking lot, pulled my briefcase from the trunk, and drove 20 minutes through the steady rain to my estate attorney's private office. David Miller had been my attorney and closest friend for over 30 years. He had stayed late at his desk, knowing I was scheduled to come by after the reception to sign the final trust transfers. When I walked into his office, David had the original documents neatly laid out under the desk lamp: the lake house deed, the stock transfers, and the master trust fund, all naming Clara and Brandon as the sole beneficiaries of my life's work. "Ready to make them wealthy, Arthur?" David asked, smiling as he handed me a heavy silver pen. I sat down in the leather armchair, looked at the crisp white pages for a long, silent moment, and slowly pushed the stack back across the mahogany desk. "David," I said, my voice completely steady, "we need to tear these up and draft a completely new estate plan." David paused, pulling off his reading glasses. "Arthur, what happened? You've been planning this gift for 3 years." I realized I was about to commit a terrible mistake. I replied quietly. "I was about to hand a fortune to a man who measures human worth by the size of a paycheck. I spent 40 years earning this estate with integrity. I will not use it to fund arrogance. For the next 2.5 hours, we reworked every single clause of my estate with surgical precision. First, the 4-bedroom lake house was completely removed from Clara's name. It was transferred into a permanent charitable foundation designed to provide free housing and retreats for retired low-income public school teachers. Second, my liquid trust fund, valued at $3.2 million, was locked into an irrevocable educational trust for my future unborn grandchildren, with extreme legal boundaries. Neither Clara nor Brandon could access a single dollar of the principal or interest. The funds could only be dispersed directly to accredited universities for tuition fees once the children turned 21 years of age. Third, I added a specific clause regarding my primary residence and remaining liquid accounts. Upon my passing, everything would be liquidated immediately and donated to a local youth mentoring center I had helped build 15 years ago. Finally, I added a single legal codicil for Clara. She would receive a direct inheritance of exactly $100. Accompanied by a bound printed copy of my 40 years of bank statements, showing every dollar saved, every sacrifice made, and every single tuition bill I had paid for her in full. David looked over the completed documents, signed his witness line, and looked up at me. "Arthur, this is ironclad. They can hire every lawyer in Chicago, but no judge will overturn this. Are you 100% sure?" I took my fountain pen, signed my legal signature clearly on every single page, and closed the folder. "David," I said softly, "respect is not open for negotiation. If they believe my life's work is pocket change, then they should have no problem living without it." 4 months passed. The honeymoon was over, and Brandon decided it was time for them to purchase a luxury estate in an exclusive gated community. One rainy Sunday afternoon, Clara and Brandon called asking if they could stop by my house for coffee. They arrived dressed in expensive clothes, looking supremely confident. Brandon sat on my sofa, crossed his leather shoes, and pulled a glossy property brochure from his leather briefcase. "Arthur," Brandon began, using his most persuasive corporate sales pitch, "we found an incredible property. We're putting down a bid, but we need a bridge loan of $200,000 for the down payment. Clara mentioned you had that inheritance trust set aside, and we figure it makes complete sense to release those funds now so we don't miss this market opportunity." Clara looked at me, nodding in agreement. "Dad, it would really help us get established. Brandon says his company promotion is coming through in 6 months anyway." I poured coffee into 3 porcelain cups, set the pot down on the saucer, and sat down in my armchair across from them. "Brandon," I said gently, keeping my tone light, "I thought you knew. My pension is just pocket change. Surely a successful corporate man like yourself doesn't need financial help from a retired high school administrator." Brandon's face flushed a deep red. "Arthur, come on. That was just a light joke at the wedding reception. You can't still be holding on to that. It wasn't a joke, I said, my voice dropping into a firm, unyielding tone. It was your honest assessment of my character and my life's work, and I listened to every word. I reached into the drawer of my side table, pulled out a certified copy of the revised trust agreement, and slid it across the glass coffee table. Clara picked up the heavy document, her eyes scanning down the pages. As she read through the clauses, the lake house donation, the locked grandchild trust, the charitable liquidation, the color drained completely from her face. "Dad," she whispered, her hands starting to shake. "What is this? Where is the lake house? What about the support you promised us?" "Everything I accumulated came from 40 years of honest, quiet work," I said, looking my daughter dead in the eye. "I spent my entire adult life ensuring you would never know what it feels like to struggle, but I will not allow my sacrifices to be mocked by a man who hasn't built a single thing of his own." Brandon snatched the legal papers from Clara's hands, skimming through the lawyer's terms. "This is insane. You can't do this to us. We're your family." "Family requires respect, Brandon," I said, standing up slowly and buttoning my jacket. "You stood in front of 100 people, insulted my dignity, and assumed my quiet nature meant I was stupid. You wanted to live like a king on an old man's labor. Starting today, you pay your own way." Brandon stood up, towering over me with his fists clenched. "We'll take you to court for this. You promised Clara her inheritance." "You are more than welcome to try," I replied smoothly. "David Miller drafted the documents. They are completely airtight. Now, if you'll excuse me, my coffee is getting cold." I walked to the hallway, opened the front door, and stood beside it. Brandon glared at me with pure rage, grabbed his briefcase, and stormed out into the rain. Clara lingered at the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, please," she sobbed. "I love you, Clara," I said softly, looking at her with deep sorrow. "I will always love you. But until you learn to respect the foundation you were built on, you will have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." She stepped out, and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, with a soft, final sound that echoed through the empty house. It has been 2 full years since that rainy afternoon. Brandon and Clara were forced to forfeit the luxury home. They had to downsize to a small 2-bedroom rented apartment on the edge of town. Brandon's risky business venture failed a year later, and without my financial safety net to bail him out, he was forced to take an ordinary sales job just to keep up with their mounting credit card debts. Clara calls me every single Sunday now. We don't talk about property, trusts, or money anymore. We talk about real life, about discipline, and about character. Slowly, month by month, she is beginning to understand that true human worth isn't found in designer clothes, expensive cars, or Aspen trips. It is built through quiet integrity and genuine respect. Sometimes, people in this world mistake quiet men for weak men. They think because we don't shout, fight, or brag that we do not see what is happening around us. But silence gives you the clearest vision of all. Never let anyone make you feel small for living an honest, hard-working life. And never, ever hand the fruits of your labor to those who disrespect the trees you spent a lifetime planting. If this story spoke to you, please consider subscribing to The Quiet Files. Leave a comment down below sharing your own thoughts, and stay one step ahead of those who underestimate quiet strength. Until next time, keep your head held high and protect your peace above all else.